unaware his pregnant wife was a secret billionaire who inherited his father's company. He pushed her and her mother out into the snow. What she did crushed him forever. Marcus Sterling's hands were still warm from shoving his 4 months pregnant wife into the blizzard. When he turned to kiss his mistress, completely unaware that the woman now clutching her dying mother in that deadly snowstorm was the secret billionaire who actually owned everything he thought was his. "Get out of my house," he'd screamed at Elena just moments before. His face twisted with disgust as his pregnant mistress Vivien stood behind him, laughing. "Look at yourself. You're disgusting. My father pied you. That's why he tolerated you. This baby probably isn't even mine. You trapped me with a pregnancy, but I'm done. I'm finally free of you." Those words still echoed in Elena's mind as her fingers went numb in the snow as her mother Patricia collapsed against her, coughing blood into the white darkness as both of them stumbled away from Sterling Industries, the 920 million empire. Marcus believed his father left him. The heated marble fortress, where Vivien now wrapped herself around Marcus like a victory prize. But what this cruel CEO didn't know as he poured champagne to celebrate as Vivien rubbed her 6 months pregnant belly and whispered, "Our baby will inherit everything now." As he signed divorce papers that he thought would erase Elena forever was that his father had made a choice 5 years ago that would destroy him. Thomas Sterling on his deathbed had gripped Elena's hand with his final strength and told her, "My son has my ambition, but he's lost his soul. You have my late wife's heart. Everything I built, it's yours now. Not his. Yours." Elena had kept this devastating secret buried for 5 years, watching silently as Marcus ran a company that was never his, enduring his affair with Vivien. His public mockery of her weight, his cruel comparisons, his theft of their $300,000 savings, all because she'd loved him too much to use her power. Believed too deeply that the man who had once volunteered at children's hospitals would return to her. But now, as she wrapped her thin coat around her mother's shaking body in that blizzard, as she felt their baby kick inside her, while Marcus celebrated with the woman who'd spit in her face an hour ago, as she remembered him saying, "You're too fat, too worthless, too pathetic to be a Sterling wife." Something inside Elena's gentle heart finally irrevocably shattered. What had Thomas Sterling seen in those final weeks that made him give everything to his daughter-in-law instead of his own son? What had Marcus done that was so unforgivable his dying father completely disinherited him? Why had Elena endured 5 years of humiliation and betrayal while sitting on documents that could destroy Marcus with one signature? And what would she do now that he'd thrown his pregnant wife and her dying mother into a December snowstorm? Now that he'd chosen his mistress's baby over hers? Now that he'd proven the man she'd married was dead and gone forever? The revenge waiting in that lawyer's office would crush Marcus Sterling in ways he couldn't imagine. But would it also crush what remains of Elena's innocent, forgiving heart? 7 years earlier, Elena Martinez had been reading Where the Wild Things Are to a 6-year-old leukemia patient named Sophie when she first saw Marcus Sterling cry. He'd been standing in the doorway of the children's hospital ward, this tall, handsome man, in an expensive suit that didn't belong in a place that smelled like antiseptic and fear, watching Elena make animal sounds that made the dying children laugh. Sophie had passed away 3 hours later, and Marcus had stayed the entire time holding the little girl's hand on one side, while Elena held the other. "My father makes me volunteer here," he told Elena afterwards in the hospital cafeteria. His voice breaking, he says, "I need to understand suffering before I inherit privilege. I thought it was punishment, but watching you with those kids, you make them feel safe even when they're dying. How do you do that?" Elena had looked at this broken man with kind eyes and said simply, "Because they deserve to feel loved, especially at the end. We all do." Marcus had fallen in love with her in that moment, or at least with the version of himself he wanted to be when he was with her. Their wedding had been small, intimate, in a chapel where Thomas Sterling had cried tears of joy and told Elena, "You're the daughter I prayed for. You'll save my son from himself." Elena's mother, Patricia, had worn her best dress, the cancer already starting in her lungs but not yet diagnosed. And she'd whispered to Elena, "This man sees your heart, Mija. That's rarer than you know. For the first 3 years, Marcus had been that man. He'd trace Elena's curves in bed and call her beautiful exactly as she was. He'd come home early to cook dinner with her. He'd talk about taking over Sterling Industries, not to get rich, but to honor his father's legacy of treating employees like family. But then Thomas had his first stroke, and everything started changing in ways Elena didn't understand until it was too late. Marcus's father had called Elena to the hospital during his recovery, asked her to take family medical leave from her nursing job to help him through physical therapy. Marcus had been in Tokyo closing a deal, then Singapore, then London, always somewhere else, always too busy. Elena had moved into the Sterling mansion to care for Thomas, reading him his favorite books, helping him relearn how to speak clearly, holding his hand through the frustration and fear. She'd learned things about Thomas during those months, how he'd started Sterling Industries in a garage in Ohio, how he refused to lay off workers during the 2008 recession, even when his board demanded it, how his wife Catherine had died of breast cancer when Marcus was 12, and Thomas had never fully recovered from losing her. "You remind me of Catherine," Thomas had told Elena one afternoon, his speech still slurred but his eyes clear. "She had your gentleness, your strength that looks like softness but is really steel. Marcus used to have that strength too before I pushed him so hard to be successful. I'm afraid I broke something in my boy Elena. I'm afraid I made him think love is weakness." When Marcus finally came home from London, he'd barely thanked Elena for caring for his father. He'd been different, harder, colder, obsessed with quarterly reports and market share. He'd started making comments about Elena's weight. Little jokes at first that stung like paper cuts. "Dad's recovery cooking is showing on you," he'd say with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, "maybe ease up on the pasta." Elena had started skipping meals, had joined a gym where she felt like everyone was staring at her soft body, had cried in the shower where Marcus couldn't hear, but Marcus wasn't listening anymore anyway. He'd gotten a new friend group, tech billionaires, who threw parties on yachts and mocked old money values as outdated. And then 18 months ago, Vivien Blackwell had walked into Sterling Industries for an executive assistant interview. And Elena had watched her husband begin to disappear completely. The bitter December wind cut through Elena's coat now as she supported her mother's trembling frame, their feet crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep behind them. Sterling Industries blazed with warm light, the building where Elena had brought Thomas lunch every day during his final year, where she'd organized the charity drives Marcus later canned, where she tried to keep Thomas's values alive even as Marcus dismantled them. Patricia coughed violently, her whole body convulsing, and Elena felt panic rise in her throat. Her mother's cancer had spread to her lungs 6 months ago, the treatments draining their savings before Marcus had stolen what remained. Patricia needed to be in a hospital, not stumbling through a blizzard because Marcus had decided they were trash to be thrown out. Elena pulled out her phone with shaking fingers, snow already covering the screen, and dialed the only number she knew would answer. Gregory Hutchkins picked up on the first ring, and Elena could hear the urgency in his voice because he'd been expecting this call for months now, waiting for Elena to finally say enough. "He threw us out," Elena whispered, her voice breaking as her mother collapsed against her. "Gregory, he threw us out into the snow. My mother, she can't breathe. And the baby." Her hand moved to her stomach, to the small swell that Marcus had called disgusting to the child he'd said probably wasn't even his. Gregory's response was immediate and fierce. "I'm sending a car right now in Ellen's time. It's past time. We're going to end this." The black Mercedes arrived within 12 minutes, sent by Gregory from his personal service, and the driver, a kind-faced man named Robert who'd worked for Thomas Sterling. For 30 years, wrapped both Elena and Patricia in heated blankets he kept in the trunk, specifically for emergencies. Elena watched through the rear window as Sterling Industries grew smaller, disappearing into the snow and darkness, as she thought about the last time she'd seen Thomas alive. The secret he'd made her promise to keep. The test he'd designed for his son that Marcus had failed so spectacularly. It would have broken the old man's heart. Patricia's breathing had steadied slightly in the warmth, but her lips were still blue, her hands still shaking, and Elena knew with terrible clarity that her mother was dying faster than the doctors had predicted. The stress, the cold, the shock of what Marcus had done, accelerating the cancer's grip. "Mija," Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible over the car's heater. "You have to stop protecting him now. You have to use what Thomas gave you. Please." Elena nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. Because her mother was right, and she'd been wrong for 5 years. Love hadn't prevailed. Forgiveness hadn't worked, and the gentle man she'd married had become a monster who'd just thrown his pregnant wife and dying mother-in-law into a blizzard without a second thought. The hotel Gregory arranged was the Peton, the same place where Elena and Marcus had spent their honeymoon 7 years ago, back when he'd held her in that king-sized bed, and promised he'd love her exactly as she was forever. The suite had 2 bedrooms, a living area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and a private doctor waiting when they arrived, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who examined Patricia with gentle efficiency and immediately started her on oxygen and antibiotics while shaking her head at the criminal negligence of sending someone this sick into a winter storm. Elena stood at those windows after her mother finally fell asleep. Her hand pressed against the glass, feeling her baby move inside her like a reminder of everything at stake now. And she thought about the moment everything had shattered just 2 hours ago. In the Sterling Mansion kitchen, she'd been preparing her mother's evening medications, crushing pills into applesauce the way the hospice nurse had shown her. When Marcus had walked in with Vivien draped on his arm like an expensive accessory, Vivien had been everything Elena wasn't. Tall, angular, 6 months pregnant with a belly she displayed in designer maternity wear. That cost more than Elena used to make in a month as a nurse, with the kind of sharp beauty that cut rather than comforted. "We need to talk," Marcus had said, and he'd thrown divorce papers on the counter with such casual cruelty. Bet Elena's hands had frozen mid-stir, but it was what he'd said next that had stopped her heart completely. "I've emptied our joint account, all $300,000. Consider it compensation for the years I wasted on you." Elena had stared at him, unable to process the words. Because that money, that was her mother's money too. From selling her house to help with the mansion down payment, that was the medical fund keeping Patricia alive. That was everything they had. "You can't," Elena had whispered, and Marcus had actually laughed, that cold, hollow sound that bore no resemblance to the man who had once cried over dying children. "I already did. It's in an account with Vivien's name on it now. For our real family, for our future." That's when Vivien had stepped forward, her Lawton heels clicking on the marble floor like gunshots, and done something Elena would never forget. She'd spit directly in Elena's face, the saliva sliding down her cheek while Marcus watched with something that looked almost like approval. "You're pathetic," Vivien had hissed, her hand moving to her pregnant belly in a gesture of ownership. "Look at you, fat, worthless, clinging to a man who can't stand the sight of you. My baby will inherit everything now." "Your baby," she'd laughed, cruel and sharp. "Marcus doesn't even think it's his." And Marcus hadn't defended her, hadn't corrected Vivien, hadn't done anything but pour himself a drink and tell Elena she had 1 hour to get her mother and get out of his house forever. The next morning, Elena sat across from Gregory Hutchins in his corner office overlooking Central Park, and he slid a folder across his mahogany desk that would change everything. Inside were documents proving she owned Sterling Industries, all $920 million of it, transferred to her by Thomas 5 years ago as a test for Marcus. A test her husband had failed spectacularly. Gregory's investigation had uncovered more. Marcus had embezzled $40 million in company funds to support his lifestyle with Vivien. Money that paid for the Tribeca apartment, the trips to Monaco, the jewelry, criminal fraud. Elena's phone buzzed a wedding invitation from Marcus New Year's Eve at the plaza. He wanted her there to witness his victory, to see him marry Vivien, to watch as he replaced his fat, pathetic wife with someone he called worthy. The message ended with cruel mockery. "Come if you want, Vivien, and I will enjoy watching your face." Elena looked at Gregory, this man who'd loved Thomas like a brother, and made her decision. 3 weeks later, on New Year's Eve, Elena walked into the Plaza Hotel wearing midnight blue, her pregnant belly no longer hidden but displayed with quiet dignity. The terrace room held 300 guests watching Marcus marry Vivien in a ceremony that cost more than most people earned in years. Elena sat in the back where Marcus had assigned her the worst seat, behind a column, invisible and irrelevant. But she could see the altar. She could see Marcus promising to love and cherish Vivien. And she could see Gregory Hutchins walk through those doors flanked by NYPD detectives and SEC investigators Marcus Andrew Sterling. Gregory's voice silenced the room. "You are terminated as CEO of Sterling Industries for embezzlement and fraud. You never owned this company. Your father transferred everything to Elena 5 years ago. Every dollar you stole was hers. You're under arrest." The room erupted. Vivien stumbled backward, her face twisting as she realized the fortune she'd targeted had never existed. Marcus pointed at Elena, screaming accusations, but Gregory cut through his rage. "Your father tested you. You failed." Elena stood then, walking down that aisle past 300 stunned guests, past Vivien's hatred until she faced the man she'd once loved. "Your father gave you the chance to be good without incentive," she said quietly. "You chose cruelty instead. That's why you lost everything." She walked out into the snow where her mother waited, where her baby grew, where her future finally belonged to her. Behind her, Marcus was led away in handcuffs while Vivien screamed that he'd lied, revealing she'd never loved him, only his money. 6 months later, Elena stood in Sterling Martinez Industries with baby Catherine sleeping beside her, and Patricia cancer-free in the front row. Goodness wins. Elena told the workers Marcus had fired, the ones she'd rehired. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss reminders. That character matters more than appearance. Tell us in the comments where are you watching from and what would you have done in Elena's position.